I still remember the day my parents told me to pack my bags. It was late August, just before I was set to begin my senior year of high school, and the humid heat outside matched the intense fury I felt building within me. Our narrow hallway smelled faintly of cheap bleach, and I could see the flickering overhead light from my vantage point in the living room. My father stood in the doorway, arms crossed, lips pressed in a thin line. My mother lingered behind him, more cautious, as though she expected me to lunge forward and physically beg to stay. They had spent the last hour telling me how my younger sister, Sarah, was making the local papers again for her piano recitals and her perfect grades, and how I should just stop acting jealous. I didn't realize refusing to follow in her footsteps was akin to a moral failing, but from the looks on their faces, I might as well have committed a crime. They informed me that my rebellion was too much for them to bear, that I was disruptive and ungrateful, and that the only solution was for me to leave the house. Sarah stood to the side, small hands clasped together, looking both terrified and grateful that she wasn't the one they were disowning. In that moment, I realized exactly how little I meant to them. They were willing to forfeit their firstborn child just so they could focus on grooming their golden child to further reflect their idea of perfection. I swallowed my rage and followed their instructions. By midnight, I was gone. I left behind my bedroom with the old posters of rock bands no one else liked, the small window where I'd sometimes watch the stars, and my mother's secondhand desk that I'd once used to scribble fantasy stories for English class. I snuck one last glance at Sarah, whose tear-streaked face hovered in the hallway like a ghost. My mother gave me a final half-hearted wave, as if we were acquaintances parting ways. My father didn't acknowledge me at all. That was my farewell from the people who birthed me and the sister who, though I loved her, had absorbed every ounce of affection they had to give. The moment I stepped into the night, bag in hand, I felt relief mixed with heartbreak, because I could no longer pretend I belonged in that family. I ended up staying with a friend who lived in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat. Her name was Celine, and we'd met in our sophomore year. She'd always said I was too loyal for my own good, that I gave my parents too many chances. Now I needed her generosity just to have a place to lay my head at night. Her mother was a waitress, and her father had disappeared when she was little. Even though they didn't have much, they offered me their couch without question. I spent the next months trying to hold my life together. I worked part-time at a local diner, scraping by to buy groceries and occasionally helping pay for utilities. I tried to do homework in the tiny living room while the washing machines downstairs clanked, an endless metallic chorus that sometimes lulled me into a state of numbness. It was far from ideal, but it was home in a way my parents' house had never been. I no longer felt like I had to measure up to Sarah's accomplishments or hear my father lament how I was wasting my potential while praising every breath Sarah took. Still, deep down, I missed them. I missed the idea of what a real family could be, one that nurtured both children equally. Sometimes I'd stare at the ceiling and wonder if they'd call to say they made a huge mistake, that they wanted me back. Days turned into weeks, and I heard nothing. About 2 months after I moved in with Celine, I got a letter in the mail. The envelope was small, addressed in my mother's handwriting, which made my heart skip a beat. I tore it open to find a hastily scrawled note. "We still love you, but we can't have you causing problems for Sarah. She's sensitive, and you make things difficult. Please understand. Mom." There was no mention of my well-being, no apology, only a reaffirmation that I was an obstacle to Sarah. I stuffed the note in my drawer and tried to forget about it, but it haunted my dreams. I started lashing out at people around me, except for Celine, who was an anchor of compassion in a churning sea of uncertainty. Teachers noticed my changed demeanor, but had no idea how to help. I was 17 and alone, aside from a friend's family who already had too many struggles of their own. Occasionally, I'd get updates about Sarah through social media. She was winning piano competitions, acing advanced classes, and cultivating a circle of admirers. A twinge of jealousy gnawed at me, but mostly I felt resigned. She had everything: parental love, unwavering support, recognition from the community. It wasn't her fault, but I couldn't help resenting the child whose every success seemed to push me further into oblivion. Despite my struggles, I managed to graduate. On a humid June morning, Celine's mother gave me a red rose and told me she was proud. It was one of the few times I felt genuine parental warmth from an adult. My own parents never showed up at the ceremony, and I quickly realized they never intended to. Afterward, Celine and I celebrated with greasy burgers at a diner, pretending it was the biggest feast in the world. That night, I cried in the cramped bathroom, trying to wash away the sense of abandonment that clung to me like a shadow. Still, a stubborn hope flickered. Maybe my parents would one day see me for who I was, their eldest child who'd done nothing to deserve exile. The next day, I threw myself into applying for scholarships. If they wouldn't invest in my education, I'd do it myself. The following months were a blur of essay writing, part-time shifts, and chasing any grants I could find. Eventually, I landed a partial scholarship at a state university a few hours away. It wasn't my dream school, but it was my chance to start over. I packed my meager belongings, mostly clothes, a few books, and mementos I refused to leave behind, and hugged Celine and her mother goodbye. I left behind the battered couch and the constant clank of the laundromat below, setting off to forge my future without anyone's permission or blessing. College opened a new world for me. I moved into a shoebox dorm room with a roommate who was friendly but usually out partying, leaving me with blissful solitude to read and study. The campus teemed with life, an endless tide of possibilities. At first, I felt like an imposter. I had to scrape for textbooks at used bookstores and juggle extra shifts at a local cafe just to afford basic necessities. But for the first time, I had the freedom to explore who I wanted to be without standing in a sibling's shadow. I took classes in literature, sociology, and environmental science, searching for a spark of passion. Late nights found me lying awake, wondering whether Sarah was still devoting every breath to piano. My parents never reached out to share updates about her, nor did they inquire about me. They existed in their perfect bubble, and I was building my own from scratch. Bit by bit, I started thriving. I joined the literary magazine, discovered a knack for creative writing, and published a short story that caught the eye of a professor. For a moment, my old hurts faded, replaced by the sweetness of building a life that was entirely mine. Over the next few years, I visited Celine during breaks, as her home remained the only place that welcomed me without reservations. Whenever I passed my parents' house, I saw Sarah's face on local billboards for music recitals. Sometimes I felt a flicker of pride in her, other times a pang of bitterness. Once, I nearly mustered the courage to knock on the door, but the memory of how they had cast me out made me turn away. My father's scowl and my mother's stony silence haunted me. I drove off, tears stinging my eyes, haunted by the notion that they wouldn't even want to see me. Semesters piled upon semesters, until the day I stood in a cap and gown, holding a college diploma. It was both an ending and a beginning, proof that I could succeed without their help. That night, I celebrated with new friends, raising a toast to the grit that had carried me this far. In the months that followed, I found a job as an editorial assistant at a small publishing house, sublet a tiny studio apartment, and started chipping away at my student loans. Though my life was busy and stressful, I felt an exhilarating sense of ownership over it. I was finished waiting for my parents to realize they loved me because I had learned to love myself in their absence. Then, out of the blue, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. I answered, expecting a telemarketer, only to hear my mother's voice trembling with anxiety. She said, "We need to talk," and it was the first time I'd heard from her in years. My pulse hammered as she explained that Sarah, now 13, had run away. My father was frantic, the police were involved, and they were desperate for any help they could get. They had no idea where she might have gone. The irony tasted bitter. They kicked me out and accused me of being a disruptive force, yet now they wanted me to come back and locate their favorite child. Part of me wanted to let them face the consequences of prioritizing one child so completely, but I also remembered Sarah as a little girl, hair in pigtails, gazing up at me when she first learned to play a simple tune on the piano. She was innocent in all this, a victim of the same suffocating standards that once crushed me. I told my mother I needed time to think. She started crying, pleading that they had been wrong, that they didn't know what else to do. After pacing the floor for hours in my cramped apartment, I realized I couldn't turn my back on my younger sister. I called my mother back and said I was on my way. Arriving at my parents' house, I felt oddly detached from the place that had once been my entire world. My father opened the door with a bleak expression etched into his face, and my mother hovered nearby, eyes swollen and red. Without delay, they guided me to the living room where Sarah's trophies and plaques were arrayed as though in a shrine. I couldn't tell if they were proud or haunted by these reminders of her talent. They offered me coffee, but my appetite was gone. They laid out the details. Sarah had been arguing with them for weeks, skipping piano practice, receiving warnings from teachers. But no one expected her to vanish. A note on her bed read, "I can't be perfect anymore." My mother dissolved into tears as she recounted those words. I felt a complex whirl of vindication and sorrow. Their relentless drive for perfection had backfired, yet Sarah was out there, alone. My father stumbled through an apology, but I couldn't process it over the roar of my own memories. Instead, I asked for specifics about Sarah's disappearance. If I was going to help, I needed facts, not apologies that came too late. The following days blurred together in a frenzy of phone calls and frantic searching. My parents supplied me with lists of Sarah's friends, her after-school activities, even her private diary entries, hoping I would see a clue they'd missed. I spoke to her classmates, teachers, and neighbors. Some had seen her near an abandoned playground by the railway tracks. Others mentioned how she'd often complained about her parents' smothering expectations. My father insisted she had everything any child could want: praise, private lessons, brand new equipment. So he refused to believe she might actually feel trapped. My mother wrung her hands, repeating that Sarah was too young to survive out there alone. I agreed on that count, though I suspected she'd find a friend's couch or some corner where she could breathe freely for once. Evenings found me in my old bedroom, which had been stripped bare except for Sarah's sprawl of sheet music and trophies she couldn't fit in her own room. The police were searching but had few leads. They kept asking if Sarah might have tried to call me directly. She hadn't. We barely knew each other by this point. Our interactions had been stunted by the dynamic that pit me as the lost cause and her as the rising star. My parents oscillated between frantic unity and quiet blame, exchanging wounded glares when they thought I wasn't looking. On the fifth day, a breakthrough. One of Sarah's friends had spotted her at a bus station on the outskirts of town. I raced there, my heart pounding so loudly I could feel it in my temples. The station was packed with travelers carrying suitcases, hurrying to board or disembark. I scanned the crowd, searching every young face. Then I saw her. She was huddled near a vending machine, hugging a backpack to her chest, her long hair disheveled and her eyes rimmed with fatigue. My breath caught in my throat. I approached slowly, calling her name. She froze, and for a moment, I saw fear in her eyes. I knelt down and spoke gently, assuring her I wasn't angry, that I only wanted to help. Tears pooled in her eyes as she confessed she was running away for good. She hated being a showcase child, hated feeling like any mistake would bring the whole world crashing down. She asked if I hated her for causing our parents to kick me out. That question cracked something inside me. I realized then that we were both victims of the same impossible expectations. I wrapped an arm around her, telling her she had nothing to be sorry for, that she and I were on the same side. She dissolved into sobs, and I guided her away from the station, promising I'd stand by her however I could. We ended up at a small diner a few blocks away, settling into a corner booth under fluorescent lights that buzzed in the background. I ordered Sarah a hot chocolate, and she clutched the mug with shaking hands. She looked so fragile, a far cry from the confident prodigy our parents had always paraded around. In a broken whisper, she explained how unbearable her life had become. Every day was like a performance, every misstep magnified and judged. She felt she couldn't breathe without being reminded that she was the golden child, the one who had to shine. She also felt pangs of guilt about me, convinced that if she hadn't been so perfect, I might still be at home. I did my best to assure her that none of it was her fault. Our parents had set these wheels in motion, pitting us against each other without our permission. Sarah asked if I would help her talk to them, if I would stand beside her and demand they hear her out. My first instinct was to run the other way. Why dive back into that toxic environment after finally escaping? But looking at Sarah, I saw a desperate kid who needed her older siblings' protection. So I said yes, under one condition. She had to promise to speak her truth no matter how hard it felt. We walked back into our parents' home, hand in hand. My mother gasped at the sight of Sarah and pulled her into a tearful embrace. My father stood off to the side, relief and exhaustion swirling on his face. Sarah looked at them both and said, "We need to talk." She explained, voice trembling, that she was finished being their trophy. She hated being crushed by pressure, never allowed a single breath that wasn't about achieving something. She admitted she was sorry for running away, but if they didn't change, she'd rather be anywhere else. My parents stood there, shell-shocked. This was the child they had molded for years, now unraveling in front of them. Then Sarah turned to me and I stepped forward, a knot forming in my throat. I told them how it felt to be cast aside while they poured every ounce of love into Sarah's development. I recounted the nights I spent on a friend's couch, the anguish of opening my mother's cold letter. By the time I finished, tears shone in my mother's eyes, and my father looked like he'd aged a decade in 5 minutes. They tried to defend themselves, claiming they had only wanted the best for both of us, but we met their pleas with resolute honesty. Love isn't about sacrificing one child for another's success. A long silence stretched. Then my mother apologized, voice cracking. My father mumbled a stunted apology. Sarah cried softly. They asked if I would forgive them, if I'd help them heal this fractured family. They even suggested I move back in. I hesitated, staring at them, uncertain if their remorse was real or just fear of losing both children. Gently, I said I'd consider being part of their lives, but they had to prove they wouldn't revert to old habits. The weeks that followed felt like walking on eggshells. My parents hovered, afraid to set me off, while also handling Sarah like porcelain. In private, Sarah and I reconnected as siblings for the first time. We laughed over half-forgotten childhood memories, the time she convinced me to let her paint my toenails for practice, or the day we set up a blanket fort in the living room and pretended we were explorers in a jungle. It was strange to laugh in that house, which still held echoes of tears and anger, but we tried our best to make new, better memories. My parents, meanwhile, tried to shower me with delayed praises and belated attempts at parental concern. They asked about my college life, my writing, my job. Though I appreciated the effort, I couldn't simply erase the pain of being thrown out like a nuisance. I told them that if they truly wanted to fix things, they needed to give Sarah room to decide her own path and let me define my life without constant comparisons. They nodded, eager to appease, but a wary part of me waited for the facade to crack. People don't flip their attitudes overnight, especially not those who spent years perfecting an image of their star child. Over time, I became disoriented by the uncertain ceasefire. Sarah showed signs of flourishing when allowed to be an ordinary teenager, but I sensed that our parents, particularly my father, struggled to relinquish the rigid blueprint he'd drafted for her future. He refrained from outwardly criticizing her, but his eyes clouded whenever she mentioned non-musical interests. My mother tried to broker peace, though I caught glimpses of her wringing her hands in the kitchen, torn between supporting Sarah's need for independence and feeding into my father's drive for excellence. Eventually, I told them I needed to leave. I would not be moving back in, at least not now. I needed space, time to see if their remorse was real, or if they'd slip back into old patterns the moment Sarah's star rose again. My father looked pained but agreed, my mother dabbed her eyes with tissues, and Sarah promised she'd keep in touch every day. That night, I drove back to my cramped studio apartment, feeling lighter and heavier all at once. Lighter because I had my own life to return to, heavier because I knew how quickly illusions of change could shatter. A day later, I found a mysterious note slipped under my door that read, "Leave them alone. They're not worth it. Don't let them rope you back in." It wasn't signed. I had no idea who left it, but its ominous tone rattled me. I stuffed it in a drawer, deciding I'd listen to my own instincts rather than a faceless warning. A week passed, and then Sarah called me in tears. Our parents had enrolled her in an advanced piano conservatory without consulting her. She felt trapped all over again, cornered by the same cycle we thought we'd broken. My rage flared. Had they learned nothing? I rushed back, finding my father in the living room clutching a glossy brochure for the program. He launched into a speech about wasted talent, discipline, and the importance of not squandering her gifts. My mother stood by, wringing her hands in a familiar pattern, clearly torn, yet unwilling to contradict him.